The Lord of the Rings has occasionally struggled to find a place in the video game ether. From a mediocre MOBA to a horde of action-adventure games and even a 2007 MMO that's still going strong today, the franchise sometimes fails to recapture the magic of Middle-earth in game form. So with this in mind, The Lord of the Rings Gollum doesn't exactly have a high bar to live up to. It's not like it's really aiming to compete with past entries, opting for a different spin on the classic adventure game, and the titular character is an odd pick for a protagonist, but sometimes it's the unlikeliest places a truly great idea is born. And for a game promising to explore the history of an iconic figure integral to Tolkien's epic, we can't exactly blame anyone for getting their hopes up. We did. Unfortunately though, my precious, Lord of the Rings Gollum is lacking grace, polish, and wit. It taunts you with familiar faces and places, like Gandalf, Shelob, and Mordor, then subjects you to scenes of Gollum leaping away from an explosion to safety like a malnourished Nathan Drake. The game focuses way less on his compelling attributes, his cleverness, his riddles and scheming, and more on his athletic abilities, the least imaginative aspect of his character. Lord of the Rings Gollum, it is my solemn duty to inform you, puts the mid in Middle-earth. Its bland, restrictive gameplay will have you wishing you could walk to Mount Doom, and will grow tiresome long before you reach the end of the game. This one really should have stayed in the shadows. As you might have guessed, Lord of the Rings Gollum is not a combat-heavy adventure. Lord of the Rings is an enormous tale full of heroic battles, but Gollum takes a very different approach by focusing entirely on stealth and platforming, which again isn't exactly a bad idea for a Lord of the Rings game or even a Gollum game, is it? Sadly, though, neither its stealth nor its platforming are fleshed out at all. In the first couple of chapters, the gameplay barely extends beyond scrambling across walls and hiding from orcs. Gollum is something of a parkour master in this game, with jumps that rival Sonic bounding off a spring and climbing skills that again put a certain Uncharted protagonist to shame. Lord of the Rings Gollum absorbs the most frustratingly common gameplay tropes from other mainstream titles, chews them up, and spits them back out at you. It's cookie cutter stuff. Go here, press a button, go there, press another button. It never feels like you're really in control, merely riding through some kind of vaguely Lord of the Rings themed amusement park. The most you'll ever engage with your controller or keyboard is during platforming, and that simply isn't fun enough to carry the game. You kill enemies by running up to them and holding Q for a while on a keyboard. That's literally it. But Gollum is far too weak to kill orcs wearing helmets, obviously, so most of your time will be spent skulking in the shadows, waiting for the AI to slowly move down their predetermined path. There's also a lot of trailing. You are going to be stuck for so long walking behind characters who seem to move just a tiny bit slower than you constantly. The game will waste your time at almost every turn. For a short, linear game to be worth your while, it needs to have some kind of outstanding factor. A compelling story, exceptional gameplay, gorgeous visual design. Any of these things can lift a game regardless of how much content is on offer. It's 10 chapters of fetch quests, climbing, and hiding from orcs. The gameplay never grows from that, and there's no sense of progression. The voice acting and character designs generally fall flat too. Gollum's voice is competent enough, but the characters as a whole lack the gravitas or heart required for Middle-earth. Most come off as basic impressions of the films, which is a slippery slope when the originals are so loved and revered. But most of the time, it isn't enough to actually pull you out of the world. The same can't be said for the constant interruptions though. Every few minutes of traversal leads to another cutscene or a break in the pacing. It's kind of difficult to feel immersed in the role when a cutscene ends and the game exclaims, "New objective, go to sleep." Often, Lord of the Rings Gollum feels like you're running through a list of chores, going where the game tells you to go and engaging in the slightest flourishes of gameplay along the way. Like if we were suddenly pulled away from the Battle of Helm's Deep to watch Gandalf fixing one of Shadowfax's horseshoes. Thankfully, Gollum himself isn't entirely wasted as the game's main star. His split personality with Smeagol is constantly referenced through voice lines and plays a role in the choices you make at various points in the story. Once you've made a critical choice, you have to convince your other half to side with you. Whether it's Gollum persuading Smeagol to abandon an ally, or Smeagol reminding Gollum of another character's nastiness, these decisions are a genuinely enjoyable change of pace. Unfortunately, they're extremely brief and very basic. Think the earliest conception of player dialogue in games basic. To win an argument, you pick one of a few dialogue choices, and the right one is pretty much always obvious. So, fans of Gollum may still get something out of this game, but it's hard to justify such a singular focus on a character drastically lacking in any real abilities that translate to compelling gameplay ideas. We know his story, and there's not much worthwhile lore to be learned from showing his mundane prison routine in Mordor or his relationship with a blind elf. And all of that would be enough, but predictably, the game is pretty rough all round as well. Trailers didn't exactly do much to win over the general audience, and the game follows suit with poor animations and passable visuals. The game, bizarrely, requires sky-high PC specs to run at recommended settings, which is odd for a game that looks so entirely average. We played on a lower-end PC, and while the game was playable, it wasn't exactly smooth. There are some nice looking areas, but much of the game takes place in dark caves or dungeons where the graphics fail to stand out. The settings are incredibly limited, and you can't turn off motion blur, which is a deal breaker for people who can't stand its abhorrent nausea-inducing effect. And even then, despite delays, the game feels unfinished. Gollum regularly got stuck on terrain, which is ridiculous considering how little space the game actually gives you to move around, and it's easy for your camera to clip through that terrain too, exposing the immersion-destroying void hidden behind every cliff face or cave wall. The game never allows you to have any kind of freedom, but maybe that's for the best. The more you stray from the path, the more you realise why the game had to be so restrictive. At one point, becoming annoyed with one of the game's attempts at a puzzle, we ended up accidentally climbing out of the map, and after exploring an entire area that we weren't supposed to yet, the progression broke and we had to restart the level. It was always going to be tough to pull off a Gollum game, but there is simply nothing precious about this amateur stealth adventure. In the end, throwing it into Mount Doom might make for a more valuable use of time. Lord of the Rings Gollum gets a 2 out of 5 from us. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to drop a like and subscribe, and let us know which Lord of the Rings character you want to see a game about down in the comments, and check out these videos for more of what we do here at GG Recon.